You can spend your entire life thinking somebody else is going to take that on and care and take action. And it might just be you that has to do that.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how business leaders are redefining success through ethics, accountability, and responsible growth. I'm Charlie Martin, your host, founder of TrueMark and the Andrew Green Moss Charter. And our article this week is a Financial Times piece, Can Benefit Corporations Solve AI Governance Challenges? A look at whether companies like OpenAI and Anthropic can really serve the public good, or if the Benefit Corporation label is just a clever way to dodge real accountability. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that our guest today is Asha Jay, National Geographic Explorer turned systems strategist and a leading voice on corporate impact and AI governance. Asha, it's an absolute delight to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
A real pleasure to be here.
Now, I know that you've had quite the sort of 24, 48 hours with various things going on in your world, and I really appreciate you giving up some time during this slightly frantic week that you're experiencing. But I very briefly introduced just one of, I know, numerous roles that you've had both now and over the years. For those of our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of you and your work, could you just provide us with a bit more meat on the bone about, you know, what you're interested in and what your current work looks like?
I think what informs everything I do is a deep sense of collective well-being and true representation of the diversity that is necessary for us to have a resilient and sustainable, interdependent future. And so that means it could find expression in terms of working with nonprofits that are enabling source level solutions, systemic change, like Shareholder Democracy Network, which is a nonprofit I just started working with that focuses on championing corporate governance through shareholder activism and advocacy. And the way they do that is by having civil society sector organizations create voting recommendations that allows the average shareholder like me, if you have even the smallest of holdings, you could still exercise your voice and agency through how you vote. But oftentimes when you get an email saying, hey, your proxy vote is needed, you're just like, I don't know what to do with this email. And so you just cast it aside, right? But with this particular framework, what it enables is that, particularly with the intersection with tech, channels like Iconic or Tumelo, which are the two platforms that are primarily purveying this ability, you can just put in the control number of your shareholder vote, like proxy voting. And then once you put the control number in, you can pick the nonprofits that you would normally donate to, whose values you're aligned with, as the voting recommendation frameworks through which your vote will get cast. And so it's just a one-click solution. It's super elegant, but then you don't have to go and do the due diligence. You don't have to go and read about the board of directors and see who's the best person that you would feel most aligned to vote with. And so you can be like, hey, I'm just going to go with what Sierra Club says would be the right person for this job, because that would best represent their interests, which represents my interests. And that, again, champions greater stewardship for ecological and social well-being than would be possible if you were to go through traditional conduits like ISS or Glass Lewis. So that's one effort I'm involved in.
I was going to say that was so brilliantly described and introduced, but I know from looking at your LinkedIn profile, which I know we'll certainly be linking to in all of our various materials, so our listeners and viewers can find out more about you. I know that that's just one of a series of roles and initiatives that you're involved in, but all, as you say, collected around that real drive and determination that you have to think about how business could be done differently. What I want to understand, though, and I know our listeners and viewers will be intrigued by this as well, is like, how did we get here? Like, what ultimately has driven you to get to this point in your career where I've met you before, the passion and enthusiasm that you bring to these subject areas is infectious. Like, I'm at the end of a fairly full-on 4:30 in the afternoon here in the UK day, and I'm absolutely buzzed up again to be talking to you immediately. So just talk us through, like, what has inspired you to get to this point? Can you take us back to any particular moments in your childhood or early part of your career that, has driven you to this point?
I think that like various aspects have informed my being here in this moment. And it happens over time. Like it's almost like a calibration that you've got to pay attention to. My earliest informing moment was when I started taking walks along coastlines, and it didn't matter which country I was in. And I traveled a lot as a kid. I had the privilege to do that with my family. And no matter which country I was in, I would see devastating sights of bloated dolphins washing onto the shoreline, turtles caught up in nets, or like plastic choking up the beachways, and being involved in beach cleanups every Sunday. I always volunteered. I always cared. It always affected me severely on a very cellular and emotional level. When I saw other living beings not having any sense of care being extended to them, that they cohabit the space with us, but we're just oblivious to their expression and existence, and the fact that all they need is the space to be, and we cannot have the common decency to extend that grace, has always been something that weighs on me and the choices I make.
And that's, it's so interesting. It's such a commonality. Like people talk about like the horror, the horror of seeing things of that nature and the impact that that has on them then long term in terms of being that ultimate fuel that, from a younger age has just seen them through the work that they've done. Thinking about how that then applied to your early part of your career, just talk us through kind of, what you ultimately decided to do with that energy, if you like, that you had from growing up.
Yeah, so I didn't have a clear path. I studied biochemistry and environmental science. I volunteered at every nonprofit I could think of growing up, and that was just out of pure passion as extracurriculars. And then I wound up getting into fashion designing, branding, and marketing, weirdly, because it intersected with the fact that I was modeling at that point, which I just was picked up on the street. People were like, "Oh, you're tall, you should be modeling." I was like, "Sure, why not? I'll give that a shot." And money I made off it, I would donate to the causes I cared about. So I was like, it's one more way for me to help, and so I would help that way. And then I realized, like, because I was so emotionally tethered to what was happening in the world around us, my parents recommended that I pursue an alternate path. And since modeling was one way in which I was giving back still, that maybe fashion or a more mainstream career would again allow me to divert what earnings I made towards the things I cared most about. But that's a way to sort of deflect true responsibility and be in alignment with my own calling. It was me listening to what the outside world thought would be a safer way for me to pursue what I cared about. And I didn't have the courage of character at that point to stand up for what I truly wanted to do, because I wasn't sure in myself, And so then I did pursue a degree that I do not use as extensively, but it did give me a design ethic and a sense of discipline around how I create content or create anything for that matter, because design is about form and function intersecting. So you're always thinking about the application, the consequences, the footprint producing, and if it's actually serving a purpose in this world, and what is the purpose of it. And also you think about materiality, medium, you have a more comprehensive understanding in design than you would in art, which can be a little bit more frivolous and art for art's sake. And then the other side of this is because I did that course, I started doing a follow-up course after that called IDC, which is integrated design curriculum, which is more like systems design, systems thinking.
Right. Yeah.
And design. Cool. But it allowed me to work with women in Guatemala and look at how Mayan women could remove middlemen and have a direct way of purveying their product to the tourist economy without pilfering their margins, and therefore supporting their community directly without having anyone else be part of that ecosystem, right? And so I was able to help them champion that kind of direct market presence by understanding business and marketing, and which I had to communicate without knowing Spanish, which was definitely a challenge. I had an interpreter. But I think anything is possible if you encourage people to step into a space of agency and allow them to then find expression out of their own merit, as opposed to saying that this is how you should be doing this, or here's somebody through which you can do this, because all that does is create more middlemen in the process, as opposed to allowing for direct relationships to exist.
You've described brilliantly there and I think, so many of us go into the early parts of our careers where, there's that, parental influence perhaps, which, if nothing else is we want our child to be safe and secure. And what does safe and secure look like? Well, it looks like probably in many cases not following their ultimate passion and calling, but to ultimately do something that's vocational and that's secure. You then get into this sort of experience where your curiosity is leading you down these paths of exploration. At what point in your career did you think, I am truly enacting my my true calling in terms of what I'm doing? Like, what point was that?
It happened when the BP oil spill unfolded. So after I studied the courses I did, I was still finding my footing. I didn't know where I wanted to land. And around the time when I started creating content that was still like kind of bringing an intersection between environmental science and fashion. So I was trying to create clothing out of like waste materials. I was trying to find some way to intersect what I truly cared about with where I was at, right? And then the BP oil spill happened, and I felt it on such a profound level that I watched every C-SPAN episode, like anything that was happening on at the Congressional Hill hearings, I was listening to, right, on Capitol Hill. And everything that was happening in the Gulf, I had all the information down. I took on the role of being an investigative journalist without even having the background in it. And then I went to DC because I heard there were different gatherings happening around what was going to transpire in the Gulf, how they were going to clean it. And it just felt like my own responsibility to go do that, because you can spend your entire life thinking somebody else is going to take that on and care and take action. And it might just be you that has to do that. Right. And so that was the moment where it was catalytic, where I was like, this is on me. I take responsibility for the Gulf. I'm going to show up for this in whatever way I can. And so when I went to DC, I just had no sort of inhibitions. I would jump into taxis of experts leaving for the airport and be like, I just need 10 minutes of your time. I'm not crazy, but I need to have a conversation with you. Unfortunately, because I sound the way I sound and was dressed well, I guess, because I was in fashion before, people didn't think I was insane. People were curious. So they indulged me. I was also young and very passionate, and they could sense that I genuinely cared. I also had a huge reservoir of information around the topic and knew more than they did at times. So they were like, who are you affiliated with? Which nonprofit are you working with? Like, what is your story? And then it was a very quick progression. I had Sylvia Earle there, and she was an explorer in residence at National Geographic at that point already. And she mentioned to me, I'd created like 6 different images at that point to distill what was happening in the Gulf in the simplest way, so that it could spread through early social media that existed at that point, which was like Facebook, but only within schools. And then there was like early iteration of Twitter. And I wanted to put this content out and say, hey, this is what's happening in the BP spill, because we're talking about it as if it's like all this data, but the reality of it can be expressed in a single visual. And I'd embodied sort of how life was being fueled by death, right? And it was a very powerful image. And Sylvia Earle told me, like, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but an image like this is worth 1,000 pictures. You have a unique way of articulating what you are able to perceive, and in a way that people cannot escape it. They see it in a glimpse. It's not like you have to explain this to me. It's self-evident. And so I decided to leap all in. And a week later, I was on BBC holding Tony Hayward accountable. I was one of 6 people that was aired and allowed to ask a question. And then from that platform, like, I started creating more campaign images around illicit contraband moving across borders, which it was just out of inspiration. Like, if I read a topic and it felt like something that stirred me, I would create an image and put it out. And that image became so powerful, it went viral. Back in the day when virality was not even a thing that we fully understood. But then I got a call from Uganda, and they were like, is this your image on this kid's computer? And I was like, oh my God, my image is in Africa. Like, it was just so surreal. And then, like, literally, I think about a year and a half later, which felt a lot longer in that moment, because you're living with complete uncertainty, not having any paychecks that could cover your expenses in New York, and also eating ramen behind a curtain. Like, that was my lifestyle at that point. But because I cared so much, I couldn't look away. And my parents, like, my dad died at that same intersection of events. So, like, I'd lost somebody close to me. And I realized at that point, like, my pain for him and the loss that I felt for my dad being gone was on level with the pain I felt for ecosystems being lost. It feels like I'm losing family when I'm losing the Gulf. I have to step up for the Gulf of Mexico.
And Asha, this is why it really does, everyone talks about authenticity in today's world, and it gets thrown around with such sort of lack of care in many ways. But I think I can honestly say, hand on heart, that your story and the way that you talk about these issues and what's inspired you to do, the authenticity is just dripping out of you in many ways. So what I would say is, anyone that wants to check out Asha's full story, like, again, we'll be linking to the LinkedIn profile so you guys can dive into the depths, because it is a fascinating story. And Asha, sorry, do you have like a personal blog or anything like that people can go to get a
coming out with a book, I'm sitting and working on a compendium of stories that shows sort of my entire narrative arc, because it's so diverse and it's in so many different silos that like you have to see all of it to like get the entire picture. It's very absurd and very atypical for like what people would expect my path to be where I am. So I think it informs them that you can't make any wrong moves in life. You know, it's like everything kind of feeds into one whole picture.
I love that. We talk about following your nose, following your curiosity, but equally from what you've described, follow your passion, follow the things that you will come to realize really do affect you and impact you emotionally. And those can be the drivers for you. But Asha, would you mind introducing and summarizing the article, the Financial Times piece that we're going to be discussing today?
So the article I read was Business School Teaching Case Study, Can Benefit Corporations Solve AI Governance Challenges? It was published on February 28th of this year. Artificial intelligence entities like OpenAI, Anthropic end up claiming a benefit corporation attunement to their expression as a way to claim that they're going to be a benefactor to the masses, that they're going to be mindful of societal impact, of being accountable to the greater picture. And I think many corporations can trend toward this. Some are truly informed by values to do so. Others, it can be around optics, being able to glean one from the other. You can see that through consistency of output and also the depth of engagement and transparency with which they authentically disclose when they have failed to account for something or have had a misstep. So, I mean, I think you can have a lot of different entities under the B Corp banner, but how many of them truly express with integrity is, of course, something you'd have to be more cautious about.
Asha, like when I read this, I think one of the things in the article that really struck me was this whole position, I think, towards the back end of the piece, where it was observed that you really don't need to change your corporate structure to be a benefit corporation in order to just be a good corporate citizen and ultimately have kind of sustainability based outcomes at the heart of your operation. That to me makes this whole, especially with OpenAI, this sort of slightly schizophrenic way of approaching what we are. We're a for-profit one minute, we're a not-for-profit another, we're now a benefit corporation, etc. Like, to me, it just seems confused and ultimately, like, what are you trying to do with this? Is that a fair sort of observation of from an OpenAI perspective, or have I misconstrued the nuance of it?
I mean, what they're claiming is that they're going to be responsible in how they develop and maintain advanced AI for the long-term benefit of humanity, right? And that they're going to have a material positive net impact on society and the environment. That is the commitment you're making by claiming you're going to be a benefit corp or a nonprofit. But whether or not that DNA is implicit to that firm is what is under scrutiny.
Do you think that the big AI players that we have, you know, in the world right now, in the increasingly deregulated environment, certainly in the US, that they find themselves operating in, are you worried about them, or are you optimistic that actually through these sorts of initiatives, becoming benefit corps, etc., that we kind of have the conditions, the environment from which these companies are actually going to have a positive impact?
Well, I would take a step back, and from a macro perspective across the board, no matter what we're talking about, I would say my baseline is that I'm always optimistic for humanity, because even when we're creating the most like contracted bottlenecks and are deep in the wilderness of darkness, we are still creating opportunities for light, right? By which I mean we're creating the chance to be able to perceive a light. Without that darkness, we wouldn't be able to perceive that. So we do need these contrasts in order to be able to shake out what is truly in our best interest, in the best interest of society and the environment. And so I never think of anything as a sweeping, oh no, we're doomed, and this is a time for us to like just wallow and be in a state of gloom and despair. So I would say that before I claim that, like, yes, this particular context with AI, I think it's very skewed, the current landscape, and it's also emboldened by weak enforceability, because anything requiring any laws around required transparency and reporting frequently lack the strong mechanisms to force these companies to live up to their stated benefit purpose. It opens up the world of governance washing, just as, ESG and CSR and all of the other acronyms we came up with for corporate stewardship resulted in greenwashing. So I think every time we come up with these strong, covenants and intentions, and we put these labels on it, we can just as easily lead the same label astray. And the article also draws cautionary parallels that allows us to truly see that the system can easily be co-opted. It's almost predisposed to falling into misuse. And that's partly because without that, I don't think you would be able to monetize it and remunerate at the scale at which for instance, OpenAI's for-profit arm is operating. It is exponential. The valuations, the money they've raised. So if they don't claim to have a higher purpose, it seems ridiculous that they could aggregate that kind of resources behind the expression of something that may not actually be to the benefit of all. And also I would question, how could it be? Because so much of AI is not populated in a manner that accounts for the true diversity of expression of humanity. So it cannot actually represent society if it's not built by the people, for the people, and of the people. So it's is it democratic is the first question. And I think one of the reasons, for instance, I got involved with Shareholder Democracy Network is because democracy is at the core of its tenets. And so I would say, even when we're looking at governance frameworks for these things, how equitably is it representing all of humanity when it claims to be wanting to serve the long-term benefit of all of humanity?
Can we, the question that brought up in this article, is it truly possible for us to have profit maximization as a judicial requirement of organizations operating in, Western capitalist economies, whilst also having true kind of societal benefit at the heart of the organization as well? Can you truly have those two things?
So I don't think it should be perceived as either or, because I don't think you can ever win that argument, because those who would want to profit maximize will only veer towards that, and those, because it's been pitched as a binary. But instead, if that profit was distributive, who does the profit benefit? That is the greater question to ask. And how much is it being sort of concentrated into the hands of the few, despite the ways in which it's tapping into global resources to find expression in this world? Is it giving back to any of the resources that it extracts from, that it is contingent, right? So the problem with profit maximization is it's not being maximized to the benefit of all stakeholders. It is only being maximized to the benefit of shareholders. And even that is in the case of a public company, but in the case of a private company, it's to the owners, to the people who are the investors. It's to the hands of the few who already have the wealth. And so wealth keeps concentrating versus it being actually redistributed and invested back into the very spaces that are helping inform that which you're building.
Ultimately, if the money that it's generating as this, Goliath in the AI space was properly redistributed to affect positive change across all stakeholders that are influenced by it. So we're thinking about, whether or not that's, well, in fact, give me some examples of, in that circumstance, who you would want to see benefiting from the redistribution of money made by a company like OpenAI.
Definitely from all of the different sources it's pulling information from, I would have sort of transparency into its ontologies, where is it pulling from, citing its sources, being able to kick back to the sources it's pulling from, kicking back to the artists, the creatives whose voices it's mimicking or replicating from. It's informing itself. It's not sentient. It's informing itself based on collective human expression and cumulative human expression. So of course it needs to be acknowledging and attributing with complete transparency, which it doesn't really do. So I prefer AI models that have that level of clarity built into it and feel accountability is a top priority and indispensable, as opposed to AI that is in a black box environment, which much of these large language model forums end up being in. And I think they're trying to adopt more accountability off late, because you can see like that they try to give you options, versions, and then tell you like what some sources, if you specifically ask for it, it definitely cites sources. But even then, it's not built with that as its core intention. It is an afterthought, and you can see how it's been implemented as an afterthought. So that's one aspect. The other thing is, like, first of all, is this content even truly representing all of the voices equitably? Is it been weighted properly, and are there agents informing how that prioritization of information is occurring and why? And is that sort of internal workings also being disclosed? Is that processing being disclosed to the person receiving it, so they can see, oh, hey, this is why this information is coming out in this sequencing, and why it thinks that this is how it should be structured? Because even that structure is coming from a bias or an ontology that, if it's not disclosing to the reader or the end benefiter of the content, it is actually doing the disservice. Yeah.
So actually, just to ask you on that, so what we were talking about there, you're not talking about, from a company perspective, how OpenAI goes about distributing the profits that it makes as part of its profit-making entity. You're talking about the nature of the content that it produces in its generative models, i.e., where has the influence, or what are the influences behind that content that I'm engaging with? And that, can I understand those influences to ultimately provide me with the full context as a user around where this sort of generative content's come from? Have I understood that correctly?
So I think that informs where the profits should be distributed, right? If it takes acknowledgement and is accountable and completely transparent, then it would realize how many places it's pulling from, how extractive. It is literally an expression of late stage capitalism. It's extractive, and it's like externalizing. So then, OpenAI can continue to aggregate without being capable of distribution, because it doesn't ever know who it needs to distribute to. That level of accountability emerges from actually disclosing that these are where we pull from. These are the resources. These are the individuals. These are the communities. These are the thought patterns. Like all of the things are coming from humans that have existed well before or are continuing to exist now. So to think it's coming from thin air, or AI itself is intelligent on its own, is just like somehow oracularly pulling this information from the ether, is ignorant. So I think OpenAI will not know where to be accountable and attribute without actually being transparent. And the only way they can be capable of distribution of any of the profits they make is if they're truly accountable and attributing. So they're tethered together, I think.
I want to slightly step away from OpenAI for a moment and ask you a bigger, sort of more general question, which will lead in, I think, nicely to how I imagine you're going to be wishing the magic wand. I don't know if that's the right word, using the magic wand. When you think about, so the article obviously talked about the Benefit Corp kind of governance structure, which essentially, in my mind, reading the article, it's something that doesn't have a huge amount of teeth, and ultimately is just a statement of intent, essentially, that could be kind of factored into any other kind of mission, vision statement that you likely would come across with an organization. But what would, from a governance perspective, like what would an ideal structure look like to you, considering your work moving forward? Like, what are the sorts of key things that we need to adopt for the organizations of the future to genuinely have an impact from a serving humanity perspective?
I mean, they should definitely have like governance structures like oversight councils, safety committees, and also have like diversity of voices and human expression, like a representative community that informs sort of how information is being weighted, what is being prioritized, what stories are skewing its way of regurgitating information or packaging information. Like, what is the overall scaffolding and ontology with which it's being presented is something that should be mindfully curated and contemplated. And then also in terms of like how it comes to benefit its stakeholders, like that would be tethered into that kind of like governance structure that it creates out of a true commitment and integrity towards all who help populate and hold its space, right? And help inform its content. And so I think like, and how these LLMs like churn out what they churn out, like it's coming from places and that needs to be acknowledged. So I would say, for instance, like, like how public or like general users, how are they impacted by misinformation? How does it disrupt people's lives, jobs, and like, how does it infringe on privacy? Like it needs to like account for that stakeholder group, and then it needs to be able to figure out how can it kick back and benefit that stakeholder group. Same thing with like governments and regulators, right? Like it's instead of being like, oh, only when I get a tap on my wrist am I going to behave appropriately. It's like, how can I be co-creating ways to be even more ethical and work with governments and regulators to help ensure that that is the way in which we all move forward. And I think that's kind of where they started. And then there's been a lot of contention as they've scaled and evolved and became a for-profit and then decided to be a B Corp. So like that's OpenAI's story. And then in terms of like academic and research communities, like you're not just pulling verifiable like statements about a coral reef or like climate change or anything for that matter without actually being able to attribute it to somebody else's study and work. And how is it actually benefiting like those individuals? How is that scientific progress being acknowledged and accounted for and like given back to? Civil society organizations, like how are they being like integrated into this ecosystem because they advocate for equitable access? They would ensure, for instance, that there is fairness and harm mitigation and true representation of usually marginalized voices, marginalized stories, marginalized groups, marginalized data points. And so then again, like, and then the last rung of it would also be downstream businesses, right? Like, how are they economically reliant on OpenAI's products, and also like how is OpenAI's way of weighting, prioritization, level of transparency, accountability going to affect these entities that are reliant upon its expression? So like all of these different purveyors and like of what makes them who they are, but also who they feed into. And I don't feel like there's due acknowledgement and like and true transparency around any of this from OpenAI's perspective. Anthropic, I would say, is also like a space where like they could learn from OpenAI's lessons and do one better. But just making it about intention and not having tangible ways to translate that into practice is a cop out. We'll just defer it to the next moment at which we're held accountable for not having done enough.
Let's get away with what we can, make as much money as we possibly can while we're getting away with it, and then wait to be tapped on the wrist and then possibly change the way that we behave as a result of that. Asha, I could continue to sort of pry into this with you, but I'm fascinated to see what you would do. And you've alluded to some brilliant suggestions in terms of what you would like, how you would like to see things change. But if I was now to hand you a magic wand, truly magic wand, and you could change anything in relation to what you've just described and been through in relation to the article and some of the themes that we discussed, what would you do?
I think it would be more from the different lenses from which you can do something, right? So like, and that's unfortunately how this world works, because not all authority, and it's probably good, it's distributive. Not all authority should be in anyone's hands. But I think like as a policymaker or an ethicist, like you would want to look at the parameters of how AI is expressing itself in the world. Like what is acceptable use cases? What is the ways in which it can lead to hallucinations or misinformation being churned out? When is that like, how do we rein that in? How do we ensure that it is responsible even when it's scalable? Because everybody's all like obsessed with scale because that's what market forces would want for it, is to remunerate as much as possible for those who have put it into that for-profit mechanism. But how is it actually benefiting the public? That should be the priority. And it shouldn't be like about purpose even. It should just be the core reason why it exists, because that's why and that's how it is able to populate itself. And it's the context in which it can even find expression. Otherwise, why would it be relevant or necessary in our world? So from that lens, I would look at, having AI labs be kind of mandated to publish safety metrics and sort of their accountability standards, and then create sort of like true disclosures at the end of every output that it generates. Like every time it creates an image, every time it creates content, it actually discloses its thinking and its processing, and it tells you where it's pulled information from or where it's generated that image from. That it actually ensures that benefit corporations can't just wash the ethics and claim that they are caring just through intention, but that they have like measurable obligations to the public that are actually beneficial and disclosed, that they would fund global education and AI literacy, because even those who do not rely on AI or have no access to it, because AI is also like a privilege. I don't think it reaches a vast majority that we don't even converse about, because they may not even have access to food, let alone to a computer and to AI. So like, how far are we truly being assimilative and accountable to humanity? Because it's not about just people who have wealth that who can access this technology, and how are we accountable to them? And then I would look at, like, if you're looking at it from a leader or innovator's perspective, like, are we building an ecosystem where doing good is seen not at odds with being most profitable, but rather that doing good is how you are profitable, and that your profits are also about doing good. And so then there's like a positive feedback loop, and not one that is going to further entrench bad behavior. And I think, when we're creating incentive systems, it should reward safety, not exploitation. It should reward fairness, accessibility, and not just speed, scale, and maximization of shareholder benefits in the world. Aligning investor returns with like social outcomes would be a huge way to do this. Like, I know we always look at ROI, but we don't actually look at how is this actually distributive and like creating sort of feedback into sustainable like prosperity, not just profit in the short term. And then I would say lastly,
go on. Last one, because I have to say, you have absolutely gone wild with your magic wand. I think that's 4 or 5 different separate magic wand suggestions, but go on, finish it with your last one.
Like having sort of public interest represented on the boards. Like, that's why I feel like civil society sector should be engaged more deeply. Like, we should have greater representation of the diversity of people, of democratic representation being afforded. And that can only be done through civil society, because it's the way we've structured capitalism is not going to allow for a board member from a capitalistic space being able to inform what is in the best interest of society. And so I do think they should have civil society actors at their board level.
I think my magic wand suggestion is that they hand over the control and therefore the decision making and to you, Asha. I mean, the suggestions there that you've been through are so enormous in terms of possible impact. And you've literally, I've spent so much time on the show, like asking people like, okay, great, we can all, raise the issues and the problems that are at play within the way that things are they currently are, but let's discuss some solutions. And I think you've described there numerous ideas that seem plausible and seem realistic, which is wonderful to hear in this kind of context of perhaps some of the doom and gloom conversations that you hear being had. Asha, thank you so much for joining me today. I know that was a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully you've enjoyed yourself, and we might be able to get you back on for another chapter at some point down the line.
This was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I know I can be a bit of a runway train, but if you did give me all the authority in the world, I'd probably distribute it.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Asha J for joining me today. This episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trust for communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget